to ESSA TV. My name is Dean Pagonis, President of ESSA at the University of Melbourne. ESSA TV is the first ever student-run multimedia channel at the University of Melbourne and Monash University. ESSA will be bringing you monthly videos from both universities, aiming to provide you, our members, with another rich source of economics content on our website, economicsstudents.com. Over the coming months, we'll bring you the latest news and insightful views on the Australian and global economies, including interviews and discussions with leading academics, policymakers and business leaders to get their perspective on the issues that matter. This will provide you with an online experience unmatched by any other student society on campus. I hope you enjoy our new series and feel free to provide any feedback via our Facebook, Twitter or LinkedIn pages. We now cross to Associate Professor Neville Norman at the University of Melbourne to discuss the Australian economy and the recently released federal budget with a very special guest.
Thank you very much indeed, Dean. I'm delighted to be here with the first ESSA video, and what a great achievement it is, and I wish it all well. Well, we have a very exciting time in the economy. We have a year of clarification in which we're going to get an election, almost certainly a change of government, and some clarification as to whether or not there will be any further interest rate reductions, whether we'll be in a lull and maybe even into a recession. My view is the Reserve Bank misread it. I think there are a few negative signs out there, but I think we'll stay positive. We are a slow-growing economy in a slow-growing phase. Many countries have higher GDP growth than Australia, and it's one of the interesting things in being an economist that when you look ahead and use your economics, you can bring together all these different opinions, and what a wonderful time it is to be an economist. My reading is that there is a 4% growth year out there somewhere, but you wouldn't want to rely on it in running budget estimates and so on. Why? I think China is going to be stronger than many people do. I think there's a bit of an echo effect in consumer durable and business expenditure. I think some of the mining companies are foxing. Yes, we're probably at the top of the mining construction boom, but there's a lot of real activity to go on in there. In any event, it manifests in terms of a budget, and what a turnaround it was. 2012, the budget was one in which the Gillard-Swan government decided to announce a return to surplus that year, and many of us immediately said, it's nonsense, it's not going to happen. Admitted as soon as possible, they didn't, and then of course they went on and on and on until almost Christmas, and then they decided, oh, we can't, and egg on the face, and it's been difficult for them ever since then. And of course the Grattan Institute and Professor John Daley, who's with me at the moment, has decided that they would say their bit, and of course that led the public debate. I think it's fair enough to say, John, at that time. And so we've got John to take his look at that, because remember that the government has now said, oh no, we couldn't do it. It's going to be about a $43 billion deficit for last year, and it's about $18 billion for the year we're in, not a surplus, and it'll be another 3 years before we can crawl over the line. Well, to elaborate on that and its economic significance, our special guest today, Professor John Daley of the Grattan Institute. Welcome.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Well, as you say, we've got a substantial budget hurdle ahead of us, and we were very unsurprised to see the government change the budget forecasts, because essentially what they were doing was pulling in things that were very obvious to anyone who crawled through the numbers. Firstly, that they have been systemically overestimating company tax receipts for now 4 or 5 years, and it was about time they recognised, indeed they had already recognised in a little red Treasury paper, that had to be brought to account, and also that the minerals resource rent tax and the carbon price were not going to generate anything like the kind of revenue that was expected. And those two things essentially account for going from the sort of $15 billion surpluses that had been forecast in 2 or 3 years' time down to zero, and of course the zero we were supposed to be getting for next year, bringing that down to about a $15 billion deficit. But then of course the key part of our paper was much more the longer term pressures on Australian government budgets, and they haven't gone away. Firstly, we have a number of signature promises from both sides of politics which will cost the budget around about 0.5% of GDP, things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which in the long run, quite a substantial cost to the budget. Secondly, the fall in the terms of trade. Sooner or later, minerals prices have to be lower than they are at the moment. Treasury is still forecasting that they will fall relatively slowly over a very long period, and to a level significantly higher than their long-term average. That would be surprising given the historical record. If you look at terms of trade shocks around the world over the last 30 or 40 years, usually they turn out to be symmetrical. Whatever you got on the upside, you wind up paying on the downside. And if we do see the terms of trade fall, i.e. the price of iron ore relative to the price of television sets, exports versus imports, that has a very material impact on the revenues, particularly of the Commonwealth Government, both in the company tax side and elsewhere. And that could easily take 1% of GDP, in today's terms $15 billion, off the Commonwealth budget balance. Then we have the increase in health costs, and we've seen a steady increase in health costs above GDP over the last decade. And if we keep going at the same rate, we will see ourselves spending an extra 2% of GDP on health within 10 years. That's $30 billion in today's terms. And interestingly, that's not primarily because of the ageing of the population. It's because a 60-year-old today, relative to a 60-year-old 10 years ago, goes to see the doctor more often, has more tests, has more operations, and then takes more drugs. And of course, all of that costs money. For the last decade, because we've had this tremendous run-up in the terms of trade, we didn't have to ask too many questions about who was going to pay for it. Going forwards, we're going to have to ask much tougher questions. And then finally is the projected increase in welfare costs. Not, contrary to popular opinion, as a result of middle-aged, middle-class welfare. Actually, turns out there's very little middle-class, middle-aged welfare in Australia. And indeed, budgets have benefited quite substantially from a substantial reduction in the cost of unemployment benefits. We think that over the next 10 years, those costs are likely to go up quite substantially. Firstly, because we've already got to the point where unemployment benefits, New Start, are at a level where they're probably not sustainable for the people involved in really significant financial trouble. There's a reason why no Cabinet Minister wants to go on television saying that they could live on New Start for a week. And secondly, because we're likely to see continued pressure on age pensions. Again, not so much because of the ageing of the population, meaning that more people qualify, but because we're likely to see the same pressures over the last decade as we have in the next decade as we have in the last decade, which mean that governments make decisions to increase the number of people who qualify for an age pension, and also to increase what that's worth. And in a sense, that is caused by the ageing population. There are more and more aged voters who are more and more concerned about voting themselves benefits. So all of those things put tremendous pressure on Australian government budgets. We think that collectively those things add up to about 4% of GDP. It is very plausible that in a decade we could see Australian governments collectively posting budgets deficits of 3 to 4% of GDP. That's $60 billion in today's terms, unless they do some fairly serious things to improve their underlying budget position, and that's going to be a big transformation of behaviour from the last decade.
Well, let's come in on that. For students, what we're looking at is a difference variable, and very little change in the things that make the difference make a big change. Within the difference variable is another difference variable, which is company tax, which you've heard John comment on. I'll give you a slightly different view. That was a very good analysis in terms of what we call variance, so things that can go wrong, put it away. I'll give you another variance. Suppose you're Mr. Hockey. You win the next election, okay, role play it. You've gone on and on, rabbiting on about how important it is that Labor can't ever deliver a surplus. We can. What's the political risk in a real cut and guts one? Why not raise the goods and services tax rate from 10 to 15 or maybe even 20%, as John Hewson's suggesting? There's a few political and legal obstacles on that one, but no time to discuss them. But why not go for a surplus in our first year? I've got a couple of scenarios out there in which I think that despite all the difficulties John's rightly drawn attention to, you'd have a deficit 1 year after a new government came in. Very politically unpopular, particularly some of the things that have been done to expenditure and taxes. Taxes are too low for what Australian governments want to do in this country. That's the reality. Time people said it. Anyway, let's see how it goes in about 12 months' time. We'll be able to judge, but from a political point of view, I would have thought there's every reason why an incoming Abbott government, if that's what it's going to be, would make all those forecasts wrong.